Every year, on the first Saturday in May, America glorifies the cruelty of the deadliest 2 minutes in sports. PETA on the state of horse racing today and how this year horses are dying on the road to the Kentucky Derby. Next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Guillermo, your host for this inside look at animal rights, brought to you by PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. On today's episode, the Kentucky Derby is this weekend, and once again, the cruelty of the sport is undeniable. The 2023 Kentucky Derby's first death occurred even before the race began. A horse named Wild on Ice pulled up lame while training at Churchill Downs and later was euthanized. Because of PETA's involvement to expose the cruelties of horse racing, what was once considered just part of the business, the death of a racehorse while training or in an actual race, is now noted by the media and the public. I asked PETA Senior Vice President Kathy Guillermo about the impact of horse deaths to the business of horse racing and how the public's reaction to those deaths are contributing to the sport's demise.
People care about all deaths of animals that are totally ridiculous. And there's nothing more ridiculous than an animal dying for a sport that hardly anybody cares about or bets on anymore.
And I asked that question first because this is now the 15th year. I mean, it was 2008 when a horse actually died at the Kentucky Derby and they had to euthanize. Tell me about that horse.
That was a beautiful gray filly called 8 Bells who crossed the finish line in second place in the 2008 Kentucky Derby. And as she crossed that finish line, she just crashed to the dirt track. And the people scrambled to put up screens around her so we wouldn't see, but plenty of pictures were taken. Of course, it was on network television. It was seen by millions and millions of people around the world. And what happened is that as she crossed that finish line, 8 Bells' front ankles, both of them, snapped. And she was euthanized right there on the track. This came just 2 years after another very famous horse called Barbaro shattered a leg in the Preakness Stakes. They tried to save Barbaro. It was unsuccessful ultimately after some weeks or months. I believe he was euthanized. And that also was on national television. And it was at that point, I believe, that so many people just fell out of love with racing entirely.
And it goes back to that opening question. People care about horses. And when they die, and in such a public way, it kind of shatters the image of the sport.
Well, yeah, there's nothing that says don't party like a horse's body on the track for a race that you've just watched. And I think in the last 15 years, since 8 Bells died, and since, by the way, 3 horses have died every single day on racetracks in America, horse racing has become synonymous with drugging, with doping, with death, with slaughterhouses, with misery. And we have a public now that's increasingly intolerant of the abuse of animals for entertainment or the exploitation of them. This is reflected in the decline of horse racing. I think there are probably other reasons that horse racing has declined, but in the last 15 years, I don't think anybody would deny that it's what's happening to horses that are turning people away.
So tell me about right now, what you would assess to be the state of horse racing today. The Kentucky Derby is coming up this week. It's usually the biggest day for racing. I mean, I even know it just, in my head, the phrase first Saturday in May. It's always the Kentucky Derby. It's always a reason to have a party anywhere in the country, even though you may not have horses, or even though you may not be, really engaged in horse racing, but for some reason, it's the time that people pay attention. And so what is the state of horse racing today as we approach the Kentucky Derby?
The Derby is an excuse for a party, and people like to have an excuse for a party. It's fun to wear the hats. It's fun to drink the mint juleps. You watch 2 minutes of television. You suggest who you would bet on, or perhaps you even bet on it. And then most people are not going to think about horse racing until the next May, when it's Kentucky Derby time again. And this is reflected in horse racing's own statistics. If you look at, for example, the total amount of money bet on horse racing in the United States, this is called the betting handle, it really hasn't changed in 30 years. The same amount of money being bet now is about what it was 3 decades ago. And if you adjust that for inflation, it's really fallen. If you compare that, for example, to sports betting, to betting on other kinds of sports, it's a very small industry. Even though we are talking about $12 billion bet on horse racing, it's nothing compared to other sports racing. Look at the number of thoroughbred foals who have been born. It's now about half of what it was in 2005, which is the year that 8 Bells was born. And we've looked particularly at attendance at racetracks, and most particularly in New York State. You have tracks that in the 1970s would bring out 20,000 people a night to bet. Can you imagine 20 or 25,000 people? There are these enormous stands. If you go to those same tracks today, you might see 12 or 20 people. It's a great place to go to get some alone time because no one is there. And it is true that some betting can now be done online, but that decline in the number of people going is a reflection of how little the American public really cares about horse racing right now.
Yeah, because it's important real estate, but there's no one there. It seems like the brick and mortar of horse racing is dying, but you need the brick and mortar because the horses are there. But if there's no one there attending and it shows a real decline, then maybe it should be a signal to the people who are the purveyors of horse racing that maybe it's a bad business to be in.
I think that's why we see more and more horse racing businesses turning to more general betting or to other kinds of betting than horse racing. I mean, if you look again at New York State, where we've done a deep dive because we've been trying to stop the subsidies that are keeping horse racing alive. And in many states, it only exists because there's money being pumped into it that comes from the profits of other kinds of gambling. If you look at New York State, they put in from video lottery terminal profits about $230 million a year in subsidies for the 11 racing tracks in New York State. Yet the state receives only about $10 million in taxes from the pari-mutuel wagering on those tracks. $10 million profit to the state is, by the way, the exact same amount that they were receiving in New York in 1942. So we're not talking about adjusting for inflation. If we did that, it would be ridiculous. $10 million in 1942, $10 million in 2019, the last pre-COVID, pre-pandemic year we have the statistics for. So I don't think that people want to go to races. I don't think people care about races. And if it was really all about betting online, and that's why they're not going to tracks, then we would have seen an increase in that betting handle, which we have not seen.
So tell me about some other things too. I mean, betting is one thing, but how about the horses that people are supposedly betting on? There's a drop in the number of horses out there, and you can look at the drop in the births of young baby horses.
Yes, half the number of horses born today, thoroughbred horses born today, is 15 years ago. And this reflects a shrinking industry. This is a good thing, I think. We already are seeing too many of these horses end up in slaughterhouses or in other terrible places when they're no longer useful for racing. But that is a big indicator. And there are shortages of other things too in racing, a shortage of veterinarians, people not wanting to go into that business, probably because they too often have to do the bidding of the trainers when it comes to what they dispense to the horses. Shortage of jockeys. There are all kinds of shortages in racing now that point to an incredibly shrinking industry.
And so how does it continue? Well, before I get to that question, we have a general decline in betting. We have a general decline in the number of horse stock and horses born. Tell me about the public. Horse racing is not an easy sport to participate in for a bettor. What's happening amongst the public? I mean, they're not clamoring to go to the horse races to bet their money, are they?
When I tell people what I do, and that part of my job is to deal with horse racing issues, I hear so often this question: why is horse racing even a thing anymore? Because there is so little interest in it. And a big part of that comes from what they perceive as abuse of horses and is abuse of horses. And if you look at what's happened in the last week, we are just a few days away from the Kentucky Derby. And in the last week, there have been 4 horses who have died at Churchill Downs track. One last week in training, one of the contenders for the Kentucky Derby, who was supposed to race in it, a horse called Wild on Ice, shattered a leg and was euthanized. On Sunday, a 4-year-old filly collapsed, never got up again. Yesterday, 2 horses died, one collapsing and one breaking a leg. So this is the most famous track in the week of the most famous race in America, arguably in the world, and horses are dropping dead. So that's where the public is. That's where the public is on this. And I think the horse racing industry has itself to blame for it. We have for 15 years presented ways of saving horses, of sparing horses from misery and from death. And the industry is so divided about whether or not it should make these changes, that the changes that have been made, while substantial in some areas, have been way too little in others. And so they find themselves at what I believe is a crossroads.
We got to get back to the original question about horses dying then. Why are they dying? What is it about? Is it about the overall system of racing, and that by the time the horses get to the track, they're debilitated? Or is it because of the track is unsafe? Is it because of the drugs that have been used in the past? What is it that makes racing so deadly for the horses?
It's every one of those things. And if you look at the studies that came out of the University of California at Davis, where they conduct a necropsy on every horse who dies in California, there is, in 90% of the cases, there's an injury to the bone that was not detected. And injuries to the bone sometimes are not detected when the horse is alive because the horse has been given medication that masks that injury. California's tried to deal with this. Most of the other states in racing have not. So just to give you an example, you've got a horse who's been raced too frequently, and that horse has an injury, perhaps a hairline fracture in the bone of the front leg, for example. That horse needs to be rested. It should not be anywhere near a track. And if that horse needs medication, that horse shouldn't be on a track. But what they do is give that horse medication to mask the inflammation, to deal with the inflammation and to mask the pain. So when the horse then trots out before a race, he's not feeling the pain. Nobody sees that perhaps that horse is injured or sore. The horse goes out on the track and breaks a leg. That, according to studies, is the number one reason that horses are dying on racetracks. They're not being rested. They're not being given enough time between races. There's not a good diagnosis for an injury to the bone. For the last 10 years, and if I sound angry, it's because I am. For the last 10 years, we have been trying to get the racing industry to install cutting-edge CT scanning equipment at every track. And it would begin with a study, a year-long study. There is a company called Curvebeam that has developed CT scan equipment. The horse does not have to be anesthetized. There's no moving parts. You put the horse on, you lead them right onto the equipment. A few minutes later, a complete scan is done. After the first year study, The information on that horse will be spit out by a computer program, so it doesn't have to have a veterinarian read every scan. And that will show, is there a hairline fracture? Is there stress on a bone? And even in some cases, is there soft tissue damage? This would be how the racing industry would know they're not putting vulnerable horses on the track. Short of that, they need to get rid of the drugs. They need to have people looking at all the medication records, all the injury records. They need to be observed when they're exercising by somebody who doesn't have a financial stake in it. This is some of what they've done in California to prevent deaths. And at the very least, that needs to be done. You mentioned the tracks. We know dirt tracks are dangerous. Turf tracks are a little bit less dangerous, but still dangerous. By far, the safest surface is a synthetic track. And the racing industry knows this because they follow it and they tabulate these statistics every single year. And every single year, we have seen fewer deaths on synthetic tracks, but the racetracks don't want them. I just have to say, Keeneland in Kentucky, another big racetrack that has had 3 deaths in the last few weeks, actually did put in a synthetic track, and then they took it out and put it back to dirt, even though they had fewer deaths on the synthetic.
So many things that you just mentioned, like the idea of how drugs are used to mask the pain and to make the horse feel good. It's sort of like you give the horse an aspirin, makes it feel good. It doesn't realize it's hurt. It runs like a champion. The drug wears off, and then the horse is crippled and dies. Or the horse exerts him or herself to such a degree that doesn't realize that she has an infirm leg, and she breaks down on the track.
That's exactly it.
Yeah, because a lot of people think, the drugs are used to make sure the horses run faster, which may be a residual thing, but it's really there to make sure that the lame horse doesn't feel its lameness and races and just does what these horse people want the horse to do, which is where the inhumane part comes in, right?
So much of it is inhumane. Even keeping horses in a stall for 23 hours a day with only time out on a track is inhumane. And we're talking about herd animals who like to be among their own kind, who like to run when it's their choice to run, who need to graze on pasture. And yet when we have asked racetracks, put in a turnout area with grass for these horses so that they can have some semblance of a normal life, no, in goes the new parking lot. So the priorities are all wrong. The horses are not the priorities. I think we see also the acknowledgement on the part of the industry that death is a real factor here, because we see the horses who are winners, the ones who've won big races or who've won the Derby or the Preakness or the Belmont Stakes, they'll be retired to stud at the age of 3 or 4. Very young. They're not even physically mature. But the worry is if they don't retire them and put them in the breeding shed right away, they may become vulnerable to a life-threatening injury, and then there are no stud fees. So I think we're seeing an industry that has begun racing horses in order to breed them rather than the other way around.
But now you race them to establish that, they're winners, but you got to breed them right away because the races are too dangerous, the way the conditions are.
As we've witnessed and as we've exposed in our many investigations of racetracks and of the racing industry, death is a daily part of life on the racetrack. And it used to be something that was just covered up, and that just can't be done anymore. We not only have a public that won't take it, we have a media world that is going to make sure that it gets out there.
What is the message at this stage? You just laid out where the state of racing is now. We're coming up to the biggest day in racing. What is the message to people? Should they even bother going to the Derby or paying attention to the Kentucky Derby?
The issue with the Kentucky Derby and with every race in America is that it promotes an industry that has not effectively dealt with the inherent cruelty of what it does to horses. And as long as that cruelty exists, nobody should go to the races and nobody should bet on the races. And if you want an excuse for a party on Saturday, how about it's a beautiful Saturday in May? Let's just have a party. I don't think it has to have anything to do with a racetrack that has seen 4 deaths in the last week.
there are some people who might say, yeah, let's go to the races. I haven't been to the races in years. There's a general, even though there's a lot of people watching on TV, otherwise they wouldn't put them on TV, there's still a general ignorance amongst the public about what goes on at racing, or even how to play the sport. I mean, how does a better play this? It's a very complex kind of game.
Yes, I think most people have no idea about how involved the betting can be and couldn't tell you a furlong from a trifecta. And that's why the television ratings on Kentucky Derby Day really have nothing to do with the popularity of horse racing.
And the betting handles, you say, because maybe new people aren't being brought in, they're going down.
It's the biggest worry of the racing industry right now, frankly, is how they're going to attract younger crowds. And I have seen their Spectrum reports, one after the other, in which they talk about the sad decline. PETA is often blamed for the reason for the decline, which I find very funny, because it's not an image problem that we're talking about. It's a reality problem. The reality is horses are dying. The reality is horses are going to slaughterhouses. And the reality is horses are suffering. Whether we talk about it or not, it's the reality. So wishing we would go away, or talking about doing better advertising to improve the image and attract younger patrons is pointless until they fix what their problem is. And until they fix it, the Kentucky Derby parties are going to be something that our grandparents had. And that'll be that.
Kathy Guillermo, PETA Sr.VP, who heads up the team that exposes horse racing cruelty. On the Kentucky Derby, the state of horse racing, the race is this week. Before you partake, listen to the interview again. It's a cruel sport. See more at PETA.org. And that's our show for today. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to send a link of this show to your friends, especially your horse racing friends, or maybe your horse loving friends, because they'll see just how bad horse racing is and stay away. Tell them you like the PETA Podcast. You can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok. That's EMILAMOK. Or see my vlog at amok.com, or see my work at ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. That's ALDEF, AALDEF.org/blog. Hey, by the way, happy Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, too. It's May. Or you can also get this podcast on YouTube at Emil Amok 1. That's EMILAMOK 1 on YouTube. And once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts, where you can subscribe to as well as rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided by Carbon Works. You can check them out and see them on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.